Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to yet another cloud communications industry briefing. My name is Tim McLean. I'm the director of marketing at Commio. We are a cloud voice and messaging platform with aspirations to do so much more in 2025. So you're in the right place with cloud experts. And when we talked about today's idea for the topic, I knew I had to bring back Scott Navratil, who I added this to his title. Scott, you didn't know I did this, but text messaging guru plus VP of working with our biggest customers and helping them grow. Welcome back in, Scott.
Oh, great to be here. Thanks, Tim.
Yeah. Thanks to your experience with Telly and now part of Cameo. Obviously,
Yeah.
that's what to me makes you a guru of text messaging. That and all the webinars we've done over the last how long has it been? 2 years, two plus?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's
And
almost a full-time job trying to keep track of all the changes.
it is, which by the way brings us to today, October 8th, 2024, whenever you're watching this, that we had to do this webinar again because the rules have changed. And you're going to come away from this content knowing what's the wording, what are the capture requirements? Yes, there's now record keeping requirements, and so much more. And we'll bring you up to speed here in, ideally here 20, 25 minutes or less, and make sure if you got questions, put them there into the chat window or reply to this email if you're watching the recording. And we're here to answer those questions. So, Scott, again, the topic is building your opt-in list. So,
Mhm.
it's both how to build that list, but also the requirements of what you need on the page when you're capturing that opt-in. There's a lot to talk about. So
Mhm.
why don't we just dive in, Scott? We'll dive in and say we always love to start with these ideas that we all know that we may have come from the voice world, but now text messaging is great to add together for an omni-channel approach. But you got to follow the rules, right?
Absolutely. And I think even with all of the changes regarding a platform, whether it's 10DLC, long code messaging, toll free or short code, we thought that these metrics and statistics would change a little bit, and they actually haven't. So even in light of everything that's changed, it still is the best way to reach, your customers. So
Yeah. And when we do send those messages, we love the response rate, which, we've said is hovered 3 minutes or less, 98% of the time, those are seen. So that's,
absolutely.
as a marketer, that makes me jealous because I have to use a lot of email. But if I could do
Yep.
texting, that's all I would do. But
Yeah. Yeah.
can't do that.
For sure.
So, but when we say here, but in terms of the rules on top, like that's all nice, but you have to have an acceptable use case in AUP, right, on your website where you're capturing that.
Yeah, I think this really and this aligns to TCPA and FCC law, basically stating that, if you're going to send a text message to a consumer or a mobile subscriber, or you're going to make a phone call to a mobile subscriber from what they call an ATDS, automated telephone dialing system,
Mm,
you have to have consent. Now, there's different variations of consent, implied consent, express written consent, etc. I think we have that in our ebooks.
yep,
But really, the key is you have to get the consumer or the mobile subscriber's approval to send them a text message or make a phone call to them.
that's
So
correct. That's
that's what
right.
this
And
is
by the way,
about.
we will have a link to our use cases ebook and our other content, by the way, with the recording of this, or if you're seeing this attached to a blog post, it should be right below this video.
Mhm.
But not only do you have to have an AUP that sort of outlines, what are you going to do with their information? What does it all mean? But also, every message recipient has to have opted in. And I think the words I like to use, or I've been hearing a lot, are first party opt in, right? Scott?
Yeah, there's been a lot of buzz about that. And I think you also got some additional information. I think that you were going to post up in one of your blogs
Mhm.
about the FCC's opinion regarding the lead gen loophole. And
Yeah.
so, really, what the FCC is looking for is that when you want to make a phone call or send a text message to a subscriber, it's a one-to-one consent, meaning you
Mhm.
can't capture or collect their consent to send them text messages or make phone calls to them, and then basically share that consent with third parties or affiliates,
Right.
right? So it means basically every person that's going to be sending that consumer a text message or a phone call has to have their consent to do that, regardless of, the brand, right?
Yep. Yep. So that's one to one. And I know that there are people out there in the ecosphere who would like to see that change loosened up potentially. But today, October of 2024, it has to be one to one. And
Yep.
lastly, your opt-in process, which will show you some of this, has to be documented because we're going back to some other interesting words that are part of this product now, but it's chain of custody, right,
Hmm.
of a communication.
Hmm.
So because the opt-in process is all the way at the beginning, you have to document it. So there may come a time where somebody may forget, or somebody may inquire, somebody may accuse you of spamming. You have to be able to go back and say, oh, this is exactly how we captured opt-in from every user.
Yeah, yeah. And I think, with the technology on the handsets, Android, iOS, even with the mobile carriers themselves now, it is so easy to go through your inbox of your text messages and say, I don't remember that. And
Yeah,
then you just swipe left, right? Report, delete and report as junk
yeah,
or report as spam. It's
right.
that easy. And it seems pretty benign, but actually that data and that those actions are being collected by the mobile carriers. And so if you exceed a certain threshold of a bunch of subscribers basically flagging your text message as unwanted or as spam, that triggers additional what they call compliance actions, and we'll get
Yeah.
into that a little bit here.
Yeah, and by the way, I know you made it sound like that number needed to be fairly high, but it really isn't, right? It's 1 or 2%.
Well, there's different metrics, and there's basically your opt-out rate, right?
Hmm.
And the target, if you actually go and read, not that anybody would want to go read this, the T-Mobile acceptable use policy lists an acceptable opt-out rate of 0.5% or less, one half of 1%.
Wow.
So, in the real world, that's just not reasonable, especially if you're in the political space. So,
Yeah.
2% has been kind of that watermark that we're all kind of using. So, keeping your opt-ins
Yeah.
below 2%. If you're between 2% and 4%, your content's probably sitting on someone's desk in a queue to go look at your use case, your message samples, and go look at your URLs to see if there's anything phishing going on. So.
Yeah.
Uh, and yeah, anything above 4%, you're definitely going to get an RCA, which is the root cause analysis
Yeah.
or an audit. So.
That's right. Which, by the way, I don't think people understand just how often those kinds of audits and requests for information, shall we call them, come back up the
Mhm.
chain to us
Yep.
in particular. Anybody who was part of this system. Yeah, and it's not all negative, right? Like we all think that all those things are negative. A lot of cases, it's just a request to make sure that we can have all that information and make sure we're doing all the things the right way.
Yep.
Anyway, we'll talk. We'll show you some good examples of this. So let's talk about opt-in forms because we know that again, if you look on the right, there's some new text in here, kind of across the board. Like things have changed recently, right?
Mhm.
So if you're capturing an opt-in, obviously it's going to be on your website. Um, what has to be on all the forms?
So and we're seeing a lot more scrutiny from the DCAs, right? The direct connect aggregators, the ones who have the gateways or the binds to the mobile carriers, and even the carriers themselves. And so, one of the things that you may have noticed if you've tried to submit a campaign through 10DLC or even toll free is that they really like, hey, you're missing all of these, they call them disclosures,
Hmm.
right? So, you can see that obviously the consent needs to have, this is a consent or is this a message? Right? Because
Right.
we have the consent forms, I think, on the next slide. So,
Hmm.
you always have to state who the brand is, the type of messages that the consumer is going to be receiving, how often, the frequency statement, right? You're going to receive, two messages per month or 10 messages per month, or I think most people just use the message frequency may vary. That's kind of a catch-all for that. And then, of course, your message and data rates may apply. And so we have some samples that get in a little bit more detail about that. But those are the things that they're looking for in the actual opt-in process, right? You have to have those present. And then if someone's opting in via text and you're sending them a confirmation message, all of those disclosures, I think is what you're showing here, have to be listed in that text message.
Right.
So if it's SMS, sometimes you're going to probably run into characters, so you can consolidate those a little bit to make space, but those have to be there.
Yep. Yep. And by the way, it's funny, Scott, because I get copied on all the tickets too when the DCAs do come back and ask for this information, and I feel like those bullets on the left are burned into my brain
Yep.
because it's like, hey, we reviewed it. These are the things that are missing, and sure enough, one, two, three of them tend to be missing on most people's opt-in forms. So
Yep.
just follow the list. Look on the right-hand side. There's a great example. It's not difficult, but it's just this is a great example of the I's that have to be dotted, the T's that have to be crossed to make sure that you're not only approved, but you're sending and you can continue to send over time.
Yep.
Opt-in forms are key. Next, we say continued because, and by the way, I made this bigger. Sherry, I know you're on the call. This was great, but I got it as big as I could because it's important to look at, noticing that each use case has to have its own opt-in checkbox, right? So you see here, here's two different examples, right? Two different checkboxes you'd have to check.
Yeah, and I know that in the next slide actually talks about email, tying consent to privacy policy, terms and conditions, email, all that stuff. For text messaging, you cannot tie messaging consent to anything else related to the interaction with that brand.
Mm,
So it's messaging only, and you have to have a consent checkbox. The checkbox does have to be there.
mhm.
We've actually had campaigns rejected because it was missing the checkbox.
Uh-huh.
And so, but you have to have a consent paragraph with all of the disclosures for each use case. So this one, it's highlighted in this teal, and you can see that there's a paragraph for notifications and alerts, and the next one is for promotional marketing. And the idea is that basically, the consumer may want to get account related notification and alerts, right? That's critical for how they do business with that brand, but they don't necessarily want the marketing promotions, right? So you can't just say, hey, by checking this box, you're consenting to receive text message from this brand for whatever content we want to send you,
Yep.
surveys, promotional marketing, all that stuff. And so if you have multiple use cases that you're submitting your campaigns under, you got to have a paragraph for each one of those. So if you're doing like one for everything, yeah, it's going to get quite a bit. You're going to have a lot of text in that opt-in box on your website.
Yeah. And all the folks who are watching this who are doing texting now, this is probably something new. Like these used to all be sort of jammed together,
Hmm.
and they can't be anymore. So there's a big change for you. And by the way,
Yeah.
and I love that we have to call out T-Mobile specifically, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
T-Mobile seems like recently they're the ones that are hammering this home the most, right? So
Yep.
it seems like they really have less tolerance for it nowadays.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I want to point out too is Tim, based on the stuff that you looked up earlier, and this is a new thing that we haven't seen recently, right? Is that e-sign consent, right? So
Hmm.
there's an actual link to it at the bottom of those paragraph, that text, that actually goes to a government website that basically talks about e-consent or digital consent. So in some cases, if you have that flexibility to build that into your website, you would hyperlink maybe e-sign to that page, or you would just reference it somewhere else. So right, but we're not really sure. It's the first time I've seen it, and it makes sense, right? I mean, the key here is to make it as clear and transparent as possible that the consumer knows exactly what they're going to be getting when they opt in to get text messages from you.
Yep. There you go. That's so interesting, Scott. This stuff just keeps on changing. And
Yeah.
by the way, my hat's off to T-Mobile. I mean, we all need to make sure that all these things are happening and that consumers only get the stuff that they want. That's what we want too, as regular people. But
And
it's onerous.
I know we're on time constraint, but
Yeah.
I think the key here, right, is that yes, it seems like a lot of work, but I mean, once you do it, once you update your website, and we have a lot of this guidance on our website and our ebooks and our 10 DLC guides and our blogs, you can look at that content and, I think once you get it done, you're pretty much good to go, especially for brands that are the brands that are sending. If you're reselling, it's the same thing. You just have to make sure that your customers provide them the content. Say your consent has to look like this. Your messages need to look like this. Once you do all of that, then it's going to save a lot of money, or a lot of time and money, because your campaigns are going to get approved, and you're not going to get a lot of audits unless there's a problem.
That's right. You got it. And by the way, I love this example. So it feels like, on the left, these are the things we were used to saying
Mhm.
that really that's not going to work anymore.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
we just talked about that, right? So if you submitted a campaign and your brand, your URL had this in your contact form, whether it's right on your homepage or if it's on a separate page, you can't say by completing this form or clicking submit that you agree to our privacy policy or terms and conditions and consent to receive emails, texts, and phone calls.
Hmm.
right? That is not acceptable. That will get rejected immediately. So what you have to do then basically is take the text message part out of that. And so we just talked about you'd have consent for each type of use case. And then you would have even a third paragraph saying, I agree to the privacy policy and terms and conditions and agree to receive emails and phone calls.
Uh-huh.
I think probably phone calls and text should maybe be taken out of that, but we're talking about messaging here. So yeah,
Right.
and the other part of it too is you can't make the phone number required. So
Hmm.
we see that a lot of times campaigns get rejected because the brand's requiring the consumer to put a phone number. And if you're providing a phone number, right, then the expectation is that you're basically, forced to receive text messages.
Yeah. Yeah. No, no bueno there.
Yep.
And I also, it's interesting, Google made all of us website owners, put an SSL certificate on our sites a couple years ago. So it's no surprise that all these capture pages need to have an SSL certificate applied if you're a webmaster. Um,
Mhm.
and yeah, and the standalone is interesting. Yeah,
Yep.
it's interesting, Scott. I still feel like I'm still coming across way too many of these where, the email and the phone numbers are required. So I think
Mhm.
people are still catching up with these new rules.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and by the way, I love this too, is that you already mentioned it earlier, is when you do opt in, like you basically want to get that confirmation text, right? It's kind of like a double opt-in where
Mhm.
you've already opted in, but now it's going to completely confirm what you just subscribed to.
Yeah, that's best practice, right? It is to, get that double opt-in and just have very, very clear consent from the subscriber. And, it's very, very clear to them that they have opted in to receive these messages. So, but it's also important to make sure that you capture that consent, right? So even if it's a double opt-in and they respond back with yes, right, you've got to ideally have a way to have those logs of those messages so you can say, yep, and they responded back via text from this phone number at this date and time with yes, confirming their opt-in for the content.
That's right. That's right. And I like again all the details here that, you got to
Mhm.
identify yourself. It's a one brand opt-in. You're not, opting in to have your information sold or multiple brands send you messages. It's this specific brand.
Yep.
What are we going to be sending you? How often am I going to get it? Oh, by the way, it might cost you a little bit of money with data rates. And
Mhm.
by the way, here's exactly how you make these communications end. And by the way, and I say this every time we do this webinar, but when somebody sends you a stop message, you need to make sure that you have a reply going back saying that, okay, that we've taken you off the list. And maybe it's just a political thing, Scott, but I reply stop to those political messages and I say 8 out of 10. I never hear anything back.
Yeah, that's the way it's supposed to work, right?
It's probably a co-opted handset. I know sometimes
Yeah,
they funnel text through other people's phones and
yeah. But you bring up a
but
good point, and I'll just add, if your stop mechanism is not working and a subscriber keeps on getting messages after they've opted out, that you're more likely to get a consent audit or worse, right? TCPA action. That person could be inclined to go out, especially if it's political traffic. They could go hire a lawyer and say, you know what, I opted out. I don't think I ever opted in. They can't
yep.
prove that I opted in. And when I did reply stop, they kept on sending me the messages. So now I want to go take them to court.
Yeah,
So, make sure your opt out, your stop mechanisms work. Make
right.
sure you test them, and you have the appropriate responses set up.
Yeah, because we both know I think T-Mobile has the worst potential penalties. We haven't heard about them using them as far as we
Mhm.
know, but it's a per message potential impact that could be quite sizable. So
Yep.
nobody wants those. Um, and then here we talk about the related web pages, which I feel like we use this capture at the bottom in every webinar that we do, which is
Mhm.
this is probably the number one thing that's missing from people's privacy policies that make them not even get their campaigns approved, right?
Yeah, I'd say probably 8 out of 10 campaigns that are rejected is because they're missing the privacy policy, or they don't have the statement, or they don't have the opt-in information or the opt-in consent language that we just covered on their websites. So
Okay.
8 out of 10 times, that's where most of rejections come from.
That's right. And by the way, and I love this too, it has to be easily accessible and viewable from the homepage. So that's why for years now I've always had privacy policy and AUP in the footer, right?
Mhm.
Make sure that people
Yep.
can find it, make sure it works. And you got to make sure you're saying that you're not going to share the data with any third parties. And oh, by the way, for law enforcement only, usually applies to folks like us or people that may need to give that chain of custody of ownership of the message transmission.
Yeah, so
But
I will add a caveat to this one. I think maybe we would have could have updated the text here, right? So what the mobile carriers and the DCOs are looking for is the statement that you will not share mobile subscriber data, which is their
ah,
consent on their opt-in. So the mobile carriers, AT&T, Verizon, T-Mobile, can't really dictate whether or not you share email,
mhm.
right, with a or an IP address or web, the cookies and those type of thing, web data, right? They can't control whether or not you share that with third parties. What they're looking for is that you're not going to share the mobile subscriber phone number and consent with third parties and affiliates. So that's a
Gotcha. Gotcha. And by the way, guys, I apologize. I need to ask you to do this, but I'm noticing that it looks like we have two submissions in the Q&A area, but I can't get to them for some reason. But if you use the chat feature, I'll see what you guys are asking about. So please use chat and not Q&A. I think they just updated Zoom and something's going
yeah.
on. I noticed it was different when I logged in. Um, and we already mentioned this, but again, make it really simple to opt out and make sure that opt out is working. And I'd love if this was the response that I would get from every stop. Usually it's okay, you're unsubscribed, but this is
Mhm.
nice.
Yeah,
Uh,
I'll also add, I mean, stop is the industry standard. That's best practice. That's what everybody really uses as the barometer for opting out. But your system should also be set up to respond with end, cancel. I've seen people use no and so forth, right? So if a subscriber responds back with cancel, right, you need to be able to trigger that opt out. Like they're opted out, and you got to provide that confirmation. If they respond with end, same thing, right? So stop is the standard, but make sure that you have all variables of that set up in your system.
Yep, absolutely, absolutely. And by the way, David, great question. I should have covered this at the beginning. Yes, the answer is, in addition to the video, we will also supply a PDF version of these slides, and we will make sure before we send it that all the links, for instance, that really long house.gov link that we had there, Scott, is
Yep.
clickable before we send it to you. So look for that later this afternoon or early tomorrow morning. But really good question, David. No problem at all. No problem. And by the way, David, there'll also be links to our ebooks. Sherry, our great content person, will make sure that those are embedded in the emails and the blog post. And we highly recommend she's updating those, like you said, Scott, almost every week now, every 2 weeks. We're all working together
Yeah.
as a team to keep our website and those ebooks up to date. And those are
Yeah.
key. We had to put versioning numbers on these things. Like it's
Right.
it's getting
Yep.
crazy, but that's the
Yep.
world we live in. Um, and by the way, here's probably one of the most important slides to update everybody on for this webinar in October 2024 is sort of opt-in, opt-out documentation because now the TCR, has to make sure that everything is documented and that includes when, where, how opt-ins are collected along with the other usual suspects, right?
Yeah. And so I mean if it's 10 DLC, toll free, even short code, all of the stuff has to be provided to them. You have to prove to them that you've got everything that we just covered in place before they'll approve your campaigns. The other thing I think we briefly touched on was website URLs, right? So the other
Yeah.
thing too is I think if you've attended, previous webinars, we've pointed out that the carriers are looking that the brand that the campaign's assigned to, the URLs, if you're providing the URL in your text message, it has to match. It has to be that brand URL. So commio.com is the brand, Commio, / whatever tracking ID, if you're using tracking IDs or whatever page. You can't have a brand registered to Commio and then have the website in your text message sample and your content going to, spammy.com / 5232678, right?
Yeah,
So the URLs have to match the brand.
that's right. Which I don't know about you, Scott. It feels like these 3, 4, 5 character domains are even in more demand than they ever have been
Oh,
because
absolutely. Yeah,
got to
right.
save every character.
Yep.
I'm in the wrong business, Scott. I should be a domain reseller. Could have retired 10 years ago.
Maybe.
Anyway, just kidding. Better to be in cloud communications. It's more interesting.
Yep.
Um, and again, we mentioned this earlier, but also you need to keep good records now. So we see here that, the new rules around, if a consent audit comes through, you probably need to keep your data at least 6 months, right?
Yeah. And so, and the reason is for the audits that I've seen come through in the last, I'd say a couple of months. If you go back and look at, well, when did that message actually get sent to that consumer? Once you look up through the MDRs, you're like, that message was sent 4 months ago.
Hmm.
So That's why you need to keep it for at least 6 months. And, when I talked about how easy it is to go through your inbox and just purge it and clean it out, you could have text messages, or the subscriber could have text messages that are 4, 6, 8 months old.
Yeah,
And if they flag that as spam, delete and report junk, a message from 8 months ago, it still goes into the same reporting mechanism at the carrier. So the carrier's like, oh, I got a bunch of, spam flags from, May of
yeah,
2024. Then they send out the consent audit and say, okay, well, you got to prove opt-in for these consumers, right? So
yeah,
keep at least 6 months. If you can do longer, great. And at a minimum, right, you want to be able, and I think you can do this with simple if you're not using a more exotic, trusted form, consent software or service like a cloud service, and you just have a simple website, you're a single brand. I think Tim, you're the webmaster.
yeah.
You should be able to collect the basic form info with that checkbox and save it into a SQL database or some kind of a database so you can,
Sure.
go back and look it up. Sometimes in a perfect world, yeah, you would have the signature, have them capturing, signing the consent form, but in a lot of times having just minimum information is enough for the carriers.
That's right. That's right. I think yeah, it's pretty straightforward to collect that data and keep it stored on the back end of your website. Unless you're a super high volume marketing company,
Mhm.
that's not a lot of data. It's just a matter of getting it up and running. But
Yep.
you mentioned earlier that there is some more sort of exotic or, for pay software that can help. And because we need to now prove that every recipient opt in and be able to, one to one, like, oh, this phone number said they got spammed. Show me the opt in. There's something like
Mhm.
Trusted Form, which I think a lot of people know about from Active Prospect, is one way to, sort of have a third party be your single source of the truth that's been vetted.
Absolutely. And I think it comes down to the sensitivity of your use case. If you're a small business sending out OTP 2FAs,
Yeah.
you can probably just do basic capture. If you are sending marketing content, stuff that, may be flagged as phishing or spam, hopefully everything we've taught you up to this point, you can avoid that. But this
Yeah,
stuff is really critical to have just undeniable proof that this mobile subscriber opted in to receive this content.
that's right.
Yep.
So when that chain of custody needs to be proven, if they see that you're using Active Prospect Trusted Form, you're going to be okay. The
Yeah.
data's all going to be there. This is like the number one software for this, so something to check out.
Yep.
And I mentioned earlier, for more information, guys, even far beyond what we presented today, which I think is a really great update on what's required for opt-in, how to grow your list and prove that that you got opt-in information from all your customers. We're going to send you guys the links to our currently updated set of ebooks that'll have all this copy in place. You'll be able to easily reuse, a lot of this language. Like I said, if you're watching us live, you'll get these links in the email. But if you're watching us on our blog, just look below and you'll see all those links associated with the content. And again,
Good stuff.
I don't share you're watching. Thank you for all your help every day updating these. It feels like. And I know our customers really rely on these to stay up to date, and that's part of why we're here at Commio is to educate you and bring you this trusted, up to date information so you can send messages and stay clear of any issues.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean,
So,
it's super important. I mean, I'll just add one little thing on that. I think we're
yeah,
okay on time.
yeah,
Is that, and I hope we've kind of, conveyed this, is that we work with the carriers and the DCAs and the campaign registry every hour of every day,
yep,
right? So what we're showing you and what we're talking about is stuff that we know is factual. When the audits come in, we know what they're looking for. When the campaigns are rejected, we know specifically why they're rejected and what they were looking for. And so everything that we're telling you is if you follow these steps, you should have smooth sailing. As long as you're not actually planning on doing some fishing, but if it's legitimate commercial traffic, you should
yeah.
have no problems.
Exactly. And Scott, I always say this every one of these webinars as well, is that, if you're not currently doing messaging, a lot of this seems really daunting. But I think we would both agree that, if you come to work with somebody like Cameo, we will get to understand your use case,
Mhm.
what should be on your website, which, text messaging platform are you using? How can you, make sure you're connecting through Cameo for maximum throughput, as well as steering clear of any legal issues or any of this chain of custody stuff. We got you covered. You
Yep.
know, you put the right people in the room with our experts, and we'll vet what you're trying to accomplish, make sure you got all the right things in place, and
Mhm.
and we'll have these webinars every couple months to keep you up to date and let you know if anything changes. So I think that's the key, Scott. You'd agree that
Mhm.
there's a lot of people that say they can do what Commio does, but they don't do any of this education. They just want to get you on their platform running traffic, and the next thing you know, you're shut down. You don't know why. You can't
Mhm.
reach anybody on the phone. We're 100%
Mhm.
US based. We've got great experts like Scott and his team, our account managers. And am I trying to sell you? Maybe I am a little bit, only because we know how
Yeah.
good we are. But
Our CS team, our customer
yeah,
support, they're also experts on all of this. They understand the nuances of the campaign registry, working with the carriers. If you have a question, regarding your brand or your use case, we can look at that and say, okay, yes, this is great, or no, you need to make these changes in order for this to be approved. And everything that we're talking about today, I mean, if you follow, really getting into the weeds with consent and doing it the way the carriers expect it, you're going to have success not on just 10DLC, but this will translate into toll-free success as well as short codes, right? Which are really hard to get. But if you do all of this, then you'll have a, depending on what channel you want to use, right? You're gonna be in a good spot.
yeah, for sure. Well, all right. Wait, hey, thanks to everybody who tuned in today and everybody who's watching. Like we said, there's lots of links on this page or in this email, depending on how you got to this video. Reach out with any questions you may have. For instance, every email that we send is stamped with my email, so I get all those replies. And it's easy to contact us through all the different forms on our website if you have a question. We're happy to jump on a call, walk through anything you need, and answer any question that you might have. So with that, Scott, thanks again. And
You bet.
by the way, I don't know why this suddenly popped in my head. I'm like, I think this is pretty nice that a lot of people watching this video, it'll be after, let's say, the first week of November. So hopefully the political texts have died way down at that point.
Mhm.
So we can
Yes.
get back to doing the kind of messaging that we all really want to do from a commercial
Right.
standpoint,
Yeah.
as I watch my phone light up with another call for money from somebody. So
Yep. Yep.
anyway, good luck,
All
everybody,
right.
getting through the next 30 days, and we'll talk to you guys soon. Thank you so
Thanks,
much.
everybody. Take care.